The book of Leviticus of the Holy Bible. After the thunder and fire of Mount Sinai, after the commandments were spoken and the covenant sealed, the people of Israel stood at a crossroads. God had delivered them from slavery. He had guided them, fed them, and protected them. But now came a new challenge: how to live as His people every single day. They were free, yes, but freedom without guidance turns to chaos, and so the voice of God called again, this time not from the mountaintop, but from the middle of the camp, from the tabernacle itself. Leviticus opens with God speaking to Moses from the tent of meeting. The message was clear. If Israel was to be His nation, they had to be holy, because He is holy. Holiness wasn't just about morality. It was about being different, being set apart, distinct from the other nations, clean before God, honoring Him in worship, behavior, and relationships. The first instructions God gave were about offerings. Israel was to come before Him with sacrifices, not because He needed them, but because the people needed a way to draw near, to express repentance, gratitude, and devotion. There were 5 main types of offerings. First, the burnt offering. An animal without defect was brought and entirely consumed by fire. It symbolized total surrender. Then the grain offering. It was an offering of flour, oil, and incense, representing thanksgiving and provision. Next, the peace offering. It was a shared meal, part burned, part eaten, a picture of fellowship between God and His people. Then came the sin offering to deal with unintentional wrongs, restoring purity and right standing. And finally, the guilt offering, to make things right when someone had caused harm or violated trust. Every detail, the animal chosen, how it was slaughtered, what was burned, what was eaten, was purposeful. It taught respect, awareness, and dependence on God's mercy. Next, God gave instructions for the priests, Aaron and his sons. The priests had a sacred job. They were the bridge between the people and God. They offered sacrifices, pronounced blessings, and kept the holy place in order. Their garments were symbolic, their rituals exact. They had to remain clean spiritually and physically because they ministered before a holy God. Moses anointed Aaron and his sons, poured oil on them, and offered sacrifices to dedicate them. On the 8th day, they began their ministry. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the offering. The people shouted and fell face down. God was with them. But the awe of God's presence demanded reverence. Not long after, 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, offered unauthorized fire before God, careless and disrespectful. Fire came from the Lord and consumed them. They died on the spot. It was a tragic reminder: God is not to be taken lightly. From there, God gave laws about clean and unclean things, what could be eaten, touched, or lived with. These were not just health codes, but constant lessons about purity. Certain animals were clean, like cattle, sheep, and certain fish. Others, like pigs, shellfish, and birds of prey, were unclean. Touching a dead body made someone unclean. Skin diseases like leprosy required isolation and inspection by the priests. Even mold in a house had to be dealt with. If left untreated, it could spread and defile everything. For women, childbirth brought a temporary period of uncleanness. Bodily fluids, infections, and other discharges were treated with serious care. Every case had a process for cleansing, restoration, and often a sacrifice to mark the transition back into community. All of it served a point. God was holy, and His people had to live in constant awareness of that holiness. Clean and unclean were not about shame. They were about limits, responsibility, and restoration. At the center of Leviticus stands one of the most important days in the entire Bible, the Day of Atonement, also called Yom Kippur. It was the one day of the year when the high priest could enter the most holy place, the very heart of the tabernacle, behind the veil. Aaron, as high priest, first had to offer sacrifices for himself. Then 2 goats were chosen. One was sacrificed, and its blood was sprinkled on the mercy seat inside the Holy of Holies to cover the sins of the people. The second goat, known as the scapegoat, was not killed. Instead, Aaron laid hands on its head, confessing the sins of the nation over it. Then the goat was led out into the wilderness, symbolically carrying away the guilt of the people. It was a powerful picture: one life offered, another sent away. Judgment and mercy side by side. God also gave laws about moral conduct. The Israelites were not to imitate the ways of Egypt or Canaan. They were to be different in how they treated each other, in their families, and in their worship. God laid out clear boundaries about sexual behavior, violence, stealing, lying, revenge, and justice. They were told not to exploit the poor, not to mistreat foreigners, not to curse the deaf or trip the blind. These were not just laws, they were acts of compassion, equity, and honor. One law stood out. God said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." That principle, spoken in Leviticus, would later become central to Jesus' teachings. Another major theme was holiness in worship. The feasts and festivals God gave were not random. They created rhythm and memory, weekly, monthly, yearly. There was the Sabbath, a weekly rest, the Passover, remembering their rescue from Egypt, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, First Fruits, Pentecost, and the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, a time of rejoicing and remembrance of God's provision in the wilderness. These appointed times marked their calendar, yes, but more than that, they shaped their identity. They reminded Israel who they were and who God was. God also gave laws for the land. Every 7th year the land was to rest, a Sabbath year, and every 50th year a year of Jubilee was declared. Slaves were freed, debts forgiven, and land returned to original families. It was a radical system, meant to break cycles of poverty and power. Everything belonged to God, and the people were merely stewards. The last chapters of Leviticus give both blessings and warnings. If Israel followed God's commands, there would be peace, prosperity, and His presence among them. But if they turned away, if they worshipped idols, oppressed the weak, or ignored the covenant, disaster would follow. Famine, disease, invasion, and exile would come as consequences. Still, even in the warnings, God promised mercy. If the people repented, He would remember His covenant. He would not abandon them. And so Leviticus closes, not with a dramatic story or grand event, but with a clear call. Be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. It is a book of sacrifice, but also of grace, a book of laws, but also of love. God was shaping a people not just for rituals, but for righteous living. Leviticus may seem distant, even strange at times, but it teaches this timeless truth. Living with God requires more than belief. It requires reverence, obedience, and a heart set apart. Holiness is not about being perfect. It is about walking closely with the One who is.